Okay. Good to see everybody. Looking forward to seeing everyone in person, hopefully with the current wave beginning to go down. Maybe in a few weeks, months, we'll be able to meet again in person. So as I've done in previous years, this is my first year this year. I know that you've had several shiurim already. I'm going to continue in my series of what I call Parshut HaShavua, dealing with halachic issues that are connected to the parsha, sometimes directly mentioned in the parsha. That's easier, I guess, when we reach the later books of the Torah, but even in Bereshit. So there are plenty of halachic information that can be mined and connected to the parsha. So we're going to continue with that. And this week I'll start with the just share the screen in terms of the we're sent out. I want to focus on is the question of what we're going to be starting, and to a certain extent when we started on Shmini Atzeret, we started with Mashiv Ruach Umar Geshem, which in the parlance of Chazal is known as Haskarat Geshamim, the mentioning of rain. We don't actually directly request it at that point. We're just saying Mashiv Ruach Umar Geshem. God is the one who brings the rain, and we connect it to the second bracha of Shmona Esrei of Mechayim Tim. And in theory, the Mishnah tells us that we could have begun already requesting rain earlier on, and perhaps already we could have started requesting rain. There we go. Even during Sukkot itself, but we pushed that off because we're not interested in it raining on our sukkah. And then, of course, the question becomes: so why don't we just start our Tein Tal Bracha already on the beginning of the beginning of the period with Shmini Atzeret, and we'll come to the answer in a little bit. But this is the period of time, and here in Eretz Yisrael, as I'm sure just about all of you know, next week on Zayin Cheshvan, which will mean Wednesday, Tuesday night, we will begin Tein Tal Matar Levracha, and so this is an apt time of the year to begin with it, to begin discussing this, and there is a more direct connection, not only because this is the time of year that we're going to be saying Tein Tal Matar Levracha, but you can look at a perspective, a connection with the parsha. The Torah tells us, starting to look now at the Makorot, tells us, Bishnat shesh ba'od shana l'chayei Noach, b'chodesh hasheni, b'shiva asar yom l'chodesh. So on the 600th year of Noach's life, in the second month, which according to most opinions is the month of Cheshvan, b'shiva asar yom l'chodesh. So on the 17th day, not the 7th day, but the 17th day of the month, b'yom so on the 17th of Cheshvan, the Mabul begins from above and below. Nifka'u kol ma'anot tahom. So all of the sources of whatever springs or that existed, underground springs, began to pour forth, as well as, of course, the rain coming unceasingly for the next 4 days, beginning to pour down. The Torah will tell us a few parak or so later that in source number 2, u'b'chodesh hasheni b'shiva ve'esrim yom l'chodesh yavsha ha'aretz. In the second month, and again, it's the same Mar Cheshvan, second month, but now not on the 17th, but on the 27th, the land was dry, and that's when Noach receives the command to say Minatei from the ark. Now, this is after the rains have stopped. Obviously, it's also after the incident with the raven, and then the dove. This is now when they're actually able to exit the teva. Now, I'm just pointing this out. This isn't really directly related to the shiur, but it's worth noting because it has something to do with it as well. There's significance to these dates. Rashi already points this out, that there is a b'shiva asar yom l'chodesh and the shiva ve'esrim yom l'chodesh. So it works out that it's exactly 365 days that transpire. In other words, what the Torah is, you can ask, why does the Torah even bother telling us the dates? Why is this a significant issue for us? The Torah doesn't give us dates of historic events. The Torah doesn't tell us even when Matan Torah was. It's hidden. You can sort of make links in terms of based on other psukim and figure it out. And even then, with this question whether it's on the 6th of Sivan, the 7th of Sivan, when did it happen? Exactly when did the incident of the Raglim happen? So our Masorah is that it happened on Tisha B'Av. But it's the way that you get to Tisha B'Av is through a very circuitous route. The Torah doesn't tell us directly. It gives us the exact dates, and it's it's a curious fact. Why should the Torah give us the exact dates? But when you realize that it's exactly 365 days, what the Torah is telling us, in effect, is that the entire incident of the Mabul, from the beginning of it to the end, takes the
risk. Can just stay on the basket
over the course of 1 year, exactly 1 year. And the Torah is also telling us that our calendar, in this regard, is not only a lunar calendar; it's also a solar calendar. This combination, and the dates on the one hand are being to the lunar calendar, the Chodesh HaRishon, Chodesh HaSheni, etc. But the overall the year-long event is the solar year. So the Torah from its very beginning, and you can also link it to the psukim in the beginning of with regard to the fourth day of the sun and the moon, etc. The moadim that the Torah tells us that they're given for significant dates. So the calendar is already an intrinsic part of the Torah from the very beginning, and the Torah is telling us that our calendar is
it's okay. Go on. What
is an interlinked calendar? If everyone's
you iron clothes, right?
Yeah. You want me to iron?
Thank you. So the interlinked between the lunar and the solar. So the seasons are something which is very important. A few psukim later, and now this is getting more directly to our issue here. The Torah tells us Ad kol yemei haaretz. Kol yemei haaretz zera v'katzir v'kor v'chom v'kaitz v'choref v'yom v'layla lo yishpot. When God says that He regrets having having wiped out, not exactly that He will never allow it to happen again after He tastes that vayarach et reach nichoach, He smells the korbanot that Noach brings. So, as part of that promise that the world will never experience another cataclysm of the extent of the Mabul, the Torah tells us that od kol yemei haaretz, all of the days of the world, when it comes to zera, to the sowing of the fields, katsir, the harvesting, kor, b'chom, the cold season, the hot season, kayitz, the summer, choref, the winter, the yom v'layla, day and night, lo yishpotu. So these are periods of time that will never cease again. Chazal and the Gemara basically say that there are actually 6 different agricultural periods that are being referenced to here. We're not going to get into what they are and how they to the words in the psukim, but that basically this idea that we have rainy seasons, that there is a summer, a winter, etc. So this is also has been established within the context of the post-Mabul period. Now, the implication, this is something that different Parshanim point out. I'm just going to take, it's a much longer piece. I just took a snippet from Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. If anyone knows, by the way, of where the English Hirsch can be found online, I would be grateful, because I haven't been able to find it. I think that it's copyright protected, and therefore it hasn't been posted in any of the databases. So that's why I'm using the Hebrew. I could have used the German. The German is no longer copyright protected. In any event, the Rav Hirsch says the following: Od kol yemei haaretz. So the gilim lefaresh pasuk zeh. So normally speaking, what people think when you look at that pasuk is that shahaseder haragil sheyom v'layla v'onot hashana hishtabesh b'nei hamabul. So Rav Hirsch says that the normal way of speaking, thinking about this, and I speak for myself when I think about it, is that that basically the Mabul, and this is found in different opinions as well, is that basically the Mabul impacted not only on the rain and not only even on the geophysical in terms of the springs breaking forth and flooding the world, but as hinted in the pasuk, Yom v'layla lo yishbotu, day and night should not be interrupted. So that gives you the impression that that basically the entire natural order was turned on its head during this period of time, and that if Noach had stuck his head out of the teva, so exactly what it means isn't totally clear, but the idea of what we think of in terms of the normal seasons just was not operational. And that now the Torah tells us, "Umishum kach nitna kan haftacha shelo yeh mabul kazeh." So now the Torah gives us a promise that there'll never be a flood of this nature. Lo yeh yoter shibush b'malach haragil shel ha'onot. So the normal seasonal activity will not be interrupted. So that's normally what we would think when we take a look at these psukim. And I think that if I were to poll the participants right now, my guess is that the majority of us, maybe even all of us, would have said those lines. And however, and he says, Perush zeh sover shechilufei onot hashana yudim lanu kayom nahagu par lifnei hamabul. So the underlying assumption of this first Perush is that the world basically had experienced, we'll say, 3 periods. The first period being the pre-diluvian state, and that was identical to the post-diluvian state. And the only thing that is different is what happens in that 1 year in between. However, he says, "Ulam hamisorot hamekuborot biyadenu mitnagod lahanachaza." He says, however, if you take a careful look in our tradition as expressed in different opinions in Chazal, so that is not the case. That this is from this perspective changes. L'dat Rabbi Yitzchak b'Bereshit Rabbah, so he quotes a midrash that says the following: Tamid haya aviv ha'onot lo yichalfu. Haya lahem avir yafeh k'mo k'min ha'pesach ad hatzeret. So Rabbi Yitzchak wants to claim that before the Mabul, basically the world as a whole, certainly the area that people lived in at that period of time was had only basically was one seasonal, almost equatorial in its seasons, and it was the same. He picks the most pleasant time of the year, from arguably the most pleasant time of the year, the time between Pesach and Shavuot, late April and May here in Israel, where it's still the winter has passed. There generally isn't any rain. There is it's a very pleasant time. The heat of the summer hasn't really begun yet. So this is the period that he picks. Mezeg ha'avir haya shaveh mimuzag b'chol haaretz v'haaretz adayin lo hitchalka liyabashot. So he says beyond this, this is predating Pangea, that the theory of continental drift was only put forward, I believe, in the 1970s. But that basically, in the notion of tectonic plates, but Rav Hirsch wants to say there were no continents. That's Yabashot. There were no continents in the world before the Mabul. There was only that Pangea. There was one giant continent. Mishum kach efshar haya la'avor b'mihirut misof ha'olam va'ad sofo. So I don't know how quickly people could travel, and what he means by from one end of the world to the other, because it still takes a long time to by foot, let's say Eurasia and Africa. But we'll leave that aside for the moment. But basically, the idea of not being able to travel easily from one continent to the other didn't exist. And another medrash says, "Hayu mahalchin misof olam va'ad sofo l'shah kala." So people were able to go from one end of the world to the other in a short period of time. Umufurash came to Bereshit Rabbah, sha'olot hashana menuyot b'psukeinu hitchilu rak la'achar ha'mabul. So based on this, and he says it's more explicit elsewhere in Bereshit Rabbah, that the whole notion of seasons only begins after the flood. Mikan ve'elach zera v'katzir v'gomer lukach, and this is the idea is when he says zera v'katzir v'kor v'chom, it's not that it is a reversion to what was, but rather it is a new period of time, so that there were really three periods, distinct periods. It was the antediluvian state, which is in effect a worldwide, what we might think of as Gan Eden. In other words, it's true, they're no longer in the Gan, they're no longer in that Garden of Eden, whatever that was, with the Eitz Hadat and the Eitz HaChayim, and they have to work the land. But the basic conditions from a meteorological perspective is paradise. You don't have those kind of different seasons. That only begins, then you have the period of the Mabul, and then you have the antediluvian state, which is the post-diluvian state, which is our period of time, and that is what we have to deal with in terms of our seasons. So the Medrash quotes a Reb Shmuel bar Nachman, who, when the seasons would change and he felt the rain in his bones, so he would say, half jokingly, Chami, si, ma avad lan dara de mabula, right? Re'ei ma sha'asalam dor hamabul. See what the people in the Mabul have done to us. If it hadn't been for the Mabul, so I wouldn't have arthritis. Basically, that's the idea that he's trying to say. Now, this is the last paragraph here, which I just want, as I said, this is just an introduction to the halachic topic. But mezeg ha'avir Noach habilti mishtaneh al olam shalom lefnei ha'mabul haya siba gdola lashchatat darkan. So this is a very 19th century type of way of looking at the world. That basically this state of if you will, of paradise actually created the conditions that led to the Mabul. led to people having their corrupt ways. Mi garam lahem sheyimrodu bi. Right. So he quotes a line in the Medrash. What was the cause for people rebelling against me? Lo al yedei sheyuzarim v'lo kotzrin yodin v'lo kovrin. But it's basically a situation which allowed them to sow without reaping, meaning that the harvest just almost came naturally by itself. Yodin, they would have kovrin, and people barely died. Mehasefa yodin v'lo kovrin mashma Noach gara lahem le'arichut yamim. Paradise caused them or allowed them to have their extraordinary lifespans. Mikan va'elach zera v'katzir. From that point on, they had to actually sow and to reap. Mashma sheshinui ha'aklim la'achar hamabul kitzer et chayei ha'adam. So the change in the climate was actually a shortening of lifespan of people. Now, what does that mean? And this is what he continues in the longer piece, is that, and this is what I said in terms of the 19th century type of way of looking at things, is that there were those theories that tied the if you will, the success of Europe and its industriousness to the Western world as a whole, and why the Western world was able, basically from the scientific revolution on, was able to conquer the rest of the world, was basically because Europe and the northern climes in general had to deal with more severe weather changes, and as a result, that led to a rise in industriousness. People who were basically living in more temperate climates were able to get by without trying to devise ways to conquer nature and to and harness nature in the same way, and that is able, as a result, they didn't fulfill their fullest potential. This leads to all sorts of can lead to and did lead to all sorts of racist notions as well. But the idea that basically that is happening is that the sense of the climate is very important in terms of our dealing with the world, and there's a significant change, Hirsch wants to claim, between the Mabul, before the Mabul and after the Mabul. Without that change, so then the advance of man also would not happen. Or this also leads to a corruption when people are not having to deal with the difficulties that nature puts in front of us. So that also can have a corrupting influence. Too much leisure time, too much, not enough idle hands are the devil's playthings. So that's the idea that Rav Hirsch wants to claim is connected to the parsha, and this is the link to, if you will, when we now have to pray for rain. So that's something from he's speaking, if you will, from I guess, to a certain extent, a religious perspective as well, when he talks about corruption. The Torah also has a similar idea. The Torah in Parshat Ekev, Torah, I probably should have put the pasuk here. The Torah talks about Lo K'Eretz Mitzrayim Hi. The land of Israel is not like the land of Egypt, which you're able to basically cultivate just simply the same way that you have a vegetable patch, because the Nile is constantly watering the Nile Valley, and you don't have to work that hard in order to cultivate the land. Right? But rather, it's when it talks about Eretz Yisrael, the Torah continues and says that is Einei Hashem Elokecha ba beReshit Hashana v'Ad Acharitz Hashana. So you need God's providence from the beginning of the year until the end of the year. So when we have to pray for rain, so then we are in effect recognizing that our limitations, and we're turning to God for divine help and divine providence. And that is something which is spiritually uplifting. The moment that person feels that everything is within the natural order and is not related to God, so that has a deadening impact on one's spirituality, and that's something which the Torah obviously feels something which is very important not to allow to happen. So with that in mind, we now turn to the more halachic side of the discussion, namely, why do we have the bracha of Tein Tal Matal Bracha, Birchat Hashanim? Why do we start Cheshvan? Why don't we start it when we begin to talk about Mashiv Haruach and Merid HaGeshem, when we begin to discuss the rains beginning to fall? And here already in the Mishnah gives us the answer. This is the third Mishnah third Mishnah in Masechet Ta'anit. I'm just taking the quote from the Gemara, number 5. The Mishnah gives two opinions. B'shlosha b'macheshvan sho'olin et hagshamim, Rabban Gamliel omer b'shiv abo. So there are two opinions. We want to talk about what the idea here in terms of the why we should be saying perhaps on the 3rd of Cheshvan. We'll just focus on Rabban Gamliel, which is the halacha. Gamliel says on the 7th. Why? 15 yom achar achad, kedei sheyagia acharon shebiyisrael lenahar prat. So the reason is because we want to have everyone coming to Yerushalayim for Sukkot, as many people as possible, as the mitzvah of Aliyah L'Regel, and the people have to get home. And the extent of the borders of Eretz Yisrael, when you are working with donkey and camel transportation, so is basically a 15-day journey, a 2-week journey. So the 7th of Cheshvan is the 2-week point from Shmini Atzeret, and that's why we say it on Zayin Cheshvan. To be asking for rain at a period of time when we really don't want the rain to fall. We can maybe from an agricultural perspective, it's fine if it rains during these 2 weeks, but from a sociological perspective, it's something which we're not interested in having. We're not interested in it raining right now because people are traveling, and the following year that will literally put a damper on them deciding to come to Yerushalayim, because people don't really want to travel long distances and be getting soaking wet. So as a result, we wait till the 15th. However, the 7th, excuse me. Amar Rabbi Elazar, and the Rabbi Elazar says halakha Rabban Gamliel. Now it's important just to note this. We're going to come back to this in a second. Rabbi Elazar is speaking several generations after the Churban. Rabbi Elazar is living in the beginning of the 4th century. Rabban Gamliel, it's not clear which Rabban Gamliel we're referring to. Are we referring to Rabban Gamliel Hazaken, who was living during the time of the Beit HaMikdash, or it was Rabban Gamliel, his grandson, Rabban Gamliel D'Yavne, who is in the period shortly after the destruction of the Mikdash? But either way, the Beit HaMikdash is still a major feature of Jewish life. And the Aliyah L'Regel is something which is important for them. Presumably for Rabbi Elazar, by the time the 4th century rolls around, it's no longer, unfortunately, a feature of Jewish life. And yet Rabbi Elazar is still saying the halakha is like Rabban Gamliel, and we shouldn't be pushing up the date any more than we could, because it's so you could say maybe it's a Zecher LeMikdash. Why should a Zecher LeMikdash override our need for rain? Not clear. The Gemara continues and says the following: Tanya, Chananya Omer, Uvegola ad shishim bat kufa. In the Gola, in the diaspora, so the Jews there do not begin saying Tein Talmud Bracha on Zayin Cheshvan, as just about everyone in this shiur is an oleh, and we know that we start. This is one of the curious. This is a curiosity in the Jewish calendar. It is the only date which is determined not by our Jewish calendar, but by the if you will, the solar calendar. I won't say quite yet the Gregorian calendar, but it's basically focusing on, if I were to ask, when do we begin saying Tein Talmud Bracha in Chutz La'aretz? So people would say, based on what's printed in the Siddur, December 4th or December 5th. Where does that come from? So it comes from this Gemara, but yet we have to figure out where that comes from also, because Shishim B'Tkufa means 2 months, 60 days, after the autumnal equinox. Tkufa is the equinox. So or any of the major solar events here on Earth. So the equinox is called the Tkufa, the vernal equinox is a Tkufa, the solstices in the winter and in the summer are also called Tkufot. And the seasons, literally, the seasons being determined by when in terms of the Earth's rotation around the sun. So now here you have that 60 days after the autumnal equinox, that's when you should be saying Tein Talmud Bracha in the Gola. The Breita doesn't tell us why. It just states it. Now, already people are probably thinking that 1 second, 60 days after the equinox does not fall on December 4th. The equinox is on September 21st. So if that's the case, so why don't we start saying it, even if it's exactly, forgetting about what the reason is, but we should be saying it on November 21st or thereabouts, maybe off by a day, but basically November 21st. Why are we saying it on December 4th? But the reason here isn't totally clear. And we'll see as we go on some of the reasons in passing, but basically it seems as just in general, the major reason is because of the agricultural season in Bavel, modern day Iraq, where an earlier rainfall is not something which is generally called for or desired. There are those who want to say that it's the reason why they don't want rain until that period of time is that that's the end of the date harvest. For example, the date harvest, which is a staple crop in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, which is in Iraq. So that is finishes at the end of November. So that's when any rain that would fall would be detrimental to it. But basically, whatever the reason is, what the Gemara is saying is that we are interested in having the rain falling at the time it is beneficial to the place that you're in. This is the reason here for doing it later in Bavel. Now, if that's the case, so now that seems as though we should have a more sliding scale, and we'll get to that in a minute. But before we talk about that, I just want to talk about just briefly how we get from. Get it a little bit larger. Too large. Hold on. I'm sorry.
Still too large.
Too large.
Too large. Too large.
I'm having trouble with my screen. Should have left it the way it was.
Getting better.
Okay, a little more. There we go.
That's
Okay.
good.
Okay, so now, I apologize. Anyway, so the getting
Can I
back.
ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. And this is always driven me crazy about this whole sugya in Tanit. Who cares about the rain in Babel?
Okay.
Isn't everybody, every Jew in every place in the world, we're davening for rain in Eretz Yisrael? Who cares of what's going on in Chutz La'aretz?
Okay.
These prayers are for Eretz Yisrael. So why is any of that relevant?
That's exactly what this year is all about. So
All
let's
right.
for another few minutes and we'll reach that, okay? But before we do, I just want to take a look at this little calendar, which I took off from a wonderful little website, talmudology.com, that the and which deals with scientific issues that come up in the Gemara, and it's my screen is beginning. 1 second. I apologize for this. I'm having this a little difficulty with the screen. I'm going to stop touching it. Anyway, here, we'll just keep it there.
That's good. That's good.
Okay, so basically here, let's take a look at the this touch screen, it's no touch screen, and it's been giving me problems. Anyway, here we go. If you take a look at these two calendars just to understand what's going on. So if we were dealing with how do we get to December 4th? Let's deal with that first. So basically, the true equinox, as you can see on the left side of the screen, is on September 22nd, which means 60 days later will be roughly on November 21st. That's what we would expect. However, what has happened is that our calendar never caught up with the rest of the world. What do I mean by that? The calendar, and this is a bit of a machloket amongst the Amoraim itself. Generally speaking, our calendar works with something which is very close to the Gregorian calendar. The Julian calendar, named for Julius Caesar. So the Julian calendar basically has 365 views the cycle of the sun, the Earth around the sun, as taking 365 and a quarter days. And that's where you get a leap year every 4th year from, in order to take into account that extra day that adds up over time. However, in reality, it's not really that there's a 12-minute gap between 365 and a quarter and the actual amount of time that it takes the Earth to revolve around the sun. That is so that extra 12 minutes doesn't sound like much, but it adds up. It adds up to a full day every 128 years. In order to deal with that, so basically what occurred that by the 16th century, so there had been a 11-day gap between what was actually taking place in the solar world and meaning in the real world, and what the calendars were saying, and then as a result, the vernal equinox was taking place was registering around March 10th and not March 21st. That created problems for the Catholic Church in terms of trying to determine when Easter should fall out. And the decision that was made in the 16th century by, and that's why it's called the Gregorian calendar, because it was Pope Gregory who was who issued the edict, was that basically we're going to change the calendar around, that instead of having a leap year every 4th year, so every time that at the turn of the century, you would not have a leap year unless that century was divisible by 4, the way that it was back in 2000. That's taking into account that 128 days, so to 28 years, excuse me, so that you gain that day. And also that the calendar made a jump. So in the middle of October of that year, of 1589, I think it was, so the calendar jumped from October 10th to October 21st. I think those were the dates that they chose. That basically those days disappeared, and you went from October 10th, 1589 to October 21st, 1589. It took a while for the British Empire, because it was papist and the Protestant world as a whole, to accept it. Those of you who are Americans, so if you take a look, you'll see that George Washington was born on February 11th, but his birthday is celebrated as February 22nd because the British Empire adopted the Gregorian calendar about 150 years later. So after Washington was born, and his birthday jumped from the 11th to the 22nd as a result. But basically that's our calendar. Our calendar is the Gregorian calendar. The Chachamim at the time, who were aware of this change, they had to be. They lived many of them lived in the Catholic world. They did not adopt it. So as a result, what occurred was that what was now being called November 21st was, from a Jewish perspective, if you add the 11 days that we're talking about, was now around December 2nd. And that's when that's when December 2nd, that's when in the end of the 16th, beginning of the 17th century, they were saying, Mashiv HaRuach HaMorad HaGeshem. Over the course of time, so the calendar continues to lose time. And that's why, if you take a look at any siddur printed in the 19th century, it'll say there to say Mashiv HaRuach HaMorad HaGeshem on December 1st or 2nd, not on December 4th or 5th. In the turn of the 20th century, so that's when Sidurim, if you will, caught up and said to now be adding those additional days, and to be saying it now on December 4th or December 5th. Okay, so this slippage is continuing, obviously, and that's why in this, taking a look at the calendar here that he points out, so it really originally was December 1st, it now became to December 4th. In the current century, it will shift to December 5th, December 6th, and then eventually 6th and 7th. As the centuries go on, so we're going to continue to be losing days if we continue with this particular system. But Be'ezrat Hashem, obviously, that everyone should make Aliyah, and we'll all be saying it on Zayin Mar Cheshvan. Now, but Harold asked a great question, like, why do we care? I mean, okay, that's an interesting factoid as to now why we have it on December 4th, December 5th. I don't want to spend the time talking about why sometimes it's the 4th and sometimes it's the 5th, or will be the 5th and the 6th. That's a little bit too detailed to get into right now. But the question is why, shouldn't we just be praying for rain for Eretz Yisrael? And the answer seems to be that that you pray for rain for the area that you're in. And the fact that there happens to be a rainy season somewhere else, in this case Eretz Yisrael, that's all well and good, but you want it to rain where you are. If you are you're living in a community and there's drought in that community, so you're not going to have food. So you want to have the rain falling when it's supposed to fall where you're living. Now the question then becomes, of course, well, if that's the case, why are we concerned about the the rain in Iraq. We should be concerned about the rain in Spain, if that's where we live, or the rain in Australia, or the rain in the United States, wherever it may be. That's what we should be considered concerned with. So here, the Gemara talks about this in the following sources. Number 6, the Gemara says the following. We'll just start from where it's bold. Rabbi Yochanan said, Ha'amar Rabbi Yochanan, Hitchil lahaskir matchil lish'ol, Pasak milishol, posek milahaskir. Rabbi Yochanan was of the opinion which we do not follow. He was of the opinion, the Gemara says, that when you begin to say Mashiva Ruach Umorid HaGeshem, namely on Shmini Atzeret, that's when you should begin to say Tein Talamat Bracha. And when you cease to ask, namely on the first day of Pesach, so then posek milahaskir. So then you stop. When we switch on the first day of Pesach and start saying Morid Atal, that's when we should also stop saying Tein Talamat Bracha. That part we do. But the first half we don't. So the Gemara says, how can that work? Doesn't that go against what we said with according to Rabbi Elazar? And in a previous line, Rabbi Yochanan himself is attributed in saying to it. Rabbi Elazar, by the way, was a student of Rabbi Yochanan. So the Gemara says, Lo kasha, halan haluhu. So the difference is whether you're talking about the Jewish population in Eretz Yisrael or the Jewish population in Bavel. That the people in Bavel should not be starting to say Tein Talamat Bracha, but the people in Eretz Yisrael can already say Tein Talamat Bracha. So the Gemara asks, well, Ma'ishna l'didan, why is it different for us? Why do we still refrain from saying Tein Talamat Bracha, even though in Eretz Yisrael they're saying Tein Talamat Bracha? The Gemara gives an answer, De'iklan pere bidabra. The fruit is still found in the field. But as I said, I think that it's probably referring, and it's not just I'm saying, what the consensus is that it's referring to the dates that are still on the trees. And if it starts raining when the dates are on the trees, those dates are going to be bad dates. But so l'didau nami itlahu olei regalim, they too. I mean, remember, this is the Talmud Bavli. They're speaking from the perspective of Bavel. So those people in Eretz Yisrael, they have to worry about the people who are coming up from to Eretz Yisrael, coming to Yerushalayim. So the Gemara answers the obvious answer. Ki ka'amar Rabbi Yochanan bizman she'ein Beit HaMikdash kayam. Rabbi Yochanan is referring to a time after the Churban. There's no Beit HaMikdash. There's no Aliyah L'Regel, unfortunately. And therefore, Rabbi Yochanan says that there's no reason for us not to start saying Tein Talamat Bracha immediately after Shmini Atzeret. The Gemara doesn't argue the point. The Gemara leaves it here and simply says that, continues and says, well, once you bring in the Beit HaMikdash as a factor, so then you don't have to bring in Bavel as a factor. You don't have to talk about whether there are rain falling in Bavel or not, there's fruit in the field in Bavel or not. You can simply say, well, okay, this is in Eretz Yisrael, there's a difference between when the Beit HaMikdash is there or when the Beit HaMikdash isn't there. So this is would seem that according to this Gemara that we should be really starting to say Tein Talamat Bracha already immediately after Shmini Atzeret. There's another Gemara, number 7, where there's a story that's told. Shalchu le b'nei Ninveh l'Rabbi. The Jewish community that lived in the city of Ninveh. Ninveh is in northern Syria. Northeastern Syria, right near the Iraqi border. So the former Assyrian capital, going back. So there was a Jewish community, the Gemara says, in the 3rd century when Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was in charge, and they sent a query, a halachic shaila to Rabbi. Kigon anan da'afilu b'tkufat Tammuz ba'inan mitra hechinavid. We in Nineveh, so we wanted to rain, and it does rain on occasion in the middle of the summer, the season of Tammuz. So why shouldn't we, what should we do? Should we be saying the Tein Talum Matal Bracha when it's beneficial for us? Or should we say Tein Talum Matal Bracha when it's beneficial for someone else based on the Mesorah? So should we view ourselves Ki Yechidim Daminan or Karabim Daminan? Should we view ourselves as individuals or should we view ourselves as a community? And what's the difference? So the difference is, the Gemara says that if you view yourself as an individual, so then you can ask for rain for you in Shomei Tefillah, at the end of Shomei, right? But it wouldn't be part of the brachot of Tein Talum Matal Bracha. Or should we view it as being a communal issue, and then we should view it and say it in Birkat Hashanim, say it in when we say Tein Talum Matal Bracha, Mivarech Hashanim. So which one should we do? And Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's answer was Shalach Luhu Ki Yechidim Damitu Ubishomea Tefillah. So you should view yourselves as individuals and not as a major community. And as a result, you should say it, when you say it in the middle of the summer, you should say it at Shomei Tefillah, not as part of Tein Talum Matal Bracha, as part of Birchat Hashanim. The Gemara continues and says, now that's the halacha. So here we have a limitation, right? We say that individuals, communities that need rain are allowed to say and ask for rain year-round. However, they should be putting it as we put in all of our individual bakashot in Shomei Tefillah. However, communities, however we define a community, can and should be saying Tein Talum Matal Bracha when it's appropriate for that community. Now, this leads the Rambam, for example, and here there seems to be a contradiction in the Rambam. The Rambam, when he explained the Mishnah that we read earlier, the Mishnah that said that it should be said on the 7th, Rambam says the following. He says that the date of the 7th is Kol Zeh Be'eretz Yisrael V'chol Shehu Domeh. When we talk about the 7th as a date, we're talking about it in Eretz Yisrael. And only Eretz Yisrael, or those lands that have similar climates to Eretz Yisrael. Aval b'shar ha'aratzot, harei tiyeh ha'sheila b'zman ha'ra'ui l'gshamim ba'oto makom. So the Rambam says that when it comes to any other place, so you have to say, okay, I look at the climate of my current locale, and I ask for rain based on that climate. That time is the 7th of Cheshvan. I don't care whether it's actually the 7th of Mar Cheshvan. 7th of Mar Cheshvan has no Kedusha. It's just that the 7th of Mar Cheshvan was chosen as appropriate for Eretz Yisrael. But if you're in a place where it's inappropriate, so then don't say Tein Talum Matal Bracha on the 7th of Mar Cheshvan. Pick the date that it's appropriate for you. There are those lands where the rainy season is only in the spring. And Mar Cheshvan might be summertime for certain locales. So if that's the case, you're asking for rain, but the rain is actually something which is very detrimental. Right? Excuse me. So basically, the Rambam is saying that we're supposed to be people of truth. If you're asking for something, you're asking for it because you need it. And if you don't want it, then don't ask for it. That is the approach of the Rambam. However, when he got around about 20 years or so later, to writing Mishnah Torah, so he phrases it differently. Here he says, after he talks about when you should be, he points out the difference between Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz in terms of the land. He says, Be'eret halachat zayin shinar Surya u'Mitzrayim. All right. So specifically here he says that it is the lands. Shinar is Bavel, and Syria and Egypt. Those countries should be asking for the rain in the 60 days after the equinox. Then he continues, Mekomot she'en tzrichin l'gshamim b'yimot hachama kegon iyei hayamim harechokim sholid et hagshami be'et she'en tzrichin lahen b'shomei tefillah. Right, so you would expect the Rambam to have said that, based on what we just learned, that the Rambam should have said, okay, based on his logic, that it doesn't matter why pick 60 days. Okay, that makes sense for Bavel. It doesn't make sense if you are on some far-flung island. So you should be saying it, whatever is appropriate for that location. The Rambam doesn't say that. The Rambam says that that's when you can ask in Shomei Tefillah. Why the Rambam changed his mind, or if the Rambam changed his mind, isn't totally clear. The other question is that needs to be addressed is why here in Eretz Yisrael didn't we start in Shmini Atzeret? Why didn't we follow what seems to be what the Gemara that we said in source number 7, that the Gemara should be saying, that we should be saying it already from Shmini Atzeret? Why are we going to wait till next week to be saying it? So here, this question was raised by the Rishonim. First, the Ran says that really we should say that we should be saying already as of Shmini Atzeret, where as long as there isn't any agricultural reason not to be saying it. However, after he quotes the Rambam that we just quoted, as well as the Rif, who seems to agree with him, he says the following: "Midivrehem tzarich lomar dechi itzaka hilchata kirabban Gamliel hainu afilu la'achar churban." When Rabbi Lazar, remember I said that he was a student of Rabbi Yochanan, when he followed the opinion of, when he basically argued against his Rebbe and said that you should be saying the Tein Talamat Talavarcha on Zayin Cheshvan, so this is because the Ran wants to claim, without having very clear historical records to back him up, is that the minhag of going to Aliyah L'Regel continued after the Churban. The same way that people go to Yerushalayim today, so that there was a minhag for the Jewish community in Eretz Yisrael to go to Aliyah L'Regel specifically around Sukkot. And as it turns out, there is a historical record of that. As I said, the Ran was saying it as conjecture, but it turns out there is a well-documented phenomena that existed for several centuries. We're going, I believe it only finished in the 11th or 12th century, basically with the Crusades put an end to it, of the Jewish community in Eretz Yisrael making a form of Aliyah L'Regel to Yerushalayim. There are even mentions of them doing hakafot around Har Habayit on Shmini Atzeret, and so this would be the perhaps the reason the Ran says why here in Eretz Yisrael, even though there isn't a Beit HaMikdash, the minhag became or remained to be saying it on the 7th of Cheshvan and not be saying it on the immediately after Shmini Atzeret. So that's with regard to Eretz Yisrael. That's where the minhag began. I will jump just one, a few makorot to the end here, and point out the following tshuva of Rabbi Yosef based on this. Rabbi Yosef was asked the question of number 16. Miyad la'achar Chag Shmini Atzeret kodem Shiva b'Cheshvan. So the halacha is that, generally speaking, if you make a mistake and you say in the middle of the summer, so then your entire Shemona Esrei is considered to be problematic, and you have to repeat the Shemona Esrei. What happens if during this period of time, after we started Mashiva Ruach U'Morda Geshem, we said it. This is the beginning of the rainy season. Okay, and now you also mistakenly said Tein Tal U'Matal Uvracha, either because you thought that was the halacha, or you just made a mistake, one way or the other. So what should you do? And his argument is the following. He says, B'diavad, shekvar sha'al tal u'matal lifnei shiva b'cheshvan yatsa ve'en tzarich lachzor u'lihitpalel. Basically, this is the rainy season. That's what we're saying. This is the rainy season. And as a result, we should be saying Tei Tal U'Matal Bracha. The takana was to wait a couple of weeks. Is there anything terrible if you were to say Tei Tal U'Matal Bracha? Is there, to use the Rambam's lashon, is it sheker to be saying Tei Tal U'Matal Bracha now? No, it's not sheker. It's fine to be saying Tei Tal U'Matal Bracha from that perspective. We follow the minhag because the Misorah develops over time, and this is the Misorah that we have. But to now go and say that someone made a mistake and that invalidates their Shemona Esrei, so that's not the halacha. He bases it on the Shulchan Aruch, which hopefully we'll get a chance to see with regard to what happens in Chutz La'aretz. And with this, I just want to get to the a tshuva of the Rosh, which is really a phenomenal tshuva. We're not going to have time to read through it as a whole.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, very quickly.
Okay, what happens if you're living in Chutz La'aretz and you come to Israel?
Okay, so I'm going to get to it. I hope to get to it. So here's what now we're talking about the following. The Rosh asked the following question. It's the year 1313. The Rosh was born in Germany, and then for various reasons had to move, and he moved south, and he ended up in Barcelona, and became the Rav of the community in Barcelona. In the year 1313, so there was a drought in Barcelona. It hadn't rained at all during the winter. It was now Pesach time. The Rosh said that it's time, because of this, to continue to say Mashiv Haruach U'Morda Geshem, even though it's Pesach and we should be, the circumstances require rain. And really the rainy season in Spain, the rain in Spain falls mainly in the plain, but it also falls mainly in the spring. And there's no reason why you shouldn't be saying Tein Tal U'Matal Bracha in general. And he ran into opposition. It was basically a decision that he took in that Pesach of that year, telling people, continue in his shul, in his community, continue to say, he looked at it as an opportunity basically to change the halachic dialogue in general. And immediately there was a tremendous amount of backlash against it, because after all, he's changing what had been done for centuries, and that shouldn't be done. So he waited till after Pesach, and then he wrote a lengthy tshuva to explain his position, but not only to explain his position, but he also says he gives us really very valuable information as to what occurred that fateful year, if you will, of 1313. And and basically he says that he always wanted to do it coming back from the time that he lived in Germany. And he spoke about it with the leaders of the German community, and the Chachamim he was a student of the Maram Mirutenberg. Apparently his Rebbeim all agreed with him, but they said that in Germany, we saw it this past year, is that there's maybe too much rain. So, we don't have to ask for rain, even though technically speaking, it's the brachot don't really match the time, the seasons, but to ask for rain later on, it's close enough, just leave it. So in his travels, because he had to go through France, through Provence, southern France, to reach Spain, and he spoke to different communities along the way about it, and basically everyone had the same type of answer. Yeah, you're right, and we have a minhag. He said in Provence, in southern France, they have a minhag to start asking for rain in Montpellier, which is in Provence, to start it already on Zayin Cheshvan. And he said that that's a wonderful minhag that they have, but they didn't have the minhag to continue saying Tein Talmud Bracha afterwards. And when he asked into Pesach, and he asked why not, and they said, because that's just the way that it's been, and we should maybe change it, right? But we'll take it under discussion as to whether we should change it or not. And then the Rosh says that he moved on to Spain, so he doesn't know what happened in Provence. But already we see in Provence they were saying the Tein Talmud Bracha like Eretz Yisrael, and not waiting until December. However, so he was hopeful that now he reached Spain, everyone had their minhag. He was hoping that in this drought year that he would be able to basically have common sense prevail. Common sense did not prevail, right? He says, when I saw that the people just were not willing to accept the God-given truth, so the Rosh said it's just not worth the fight. And he stopped. He basically accepted the communal decision, if you will, in terms of changing the nusach. This is where if you will, the halachic discussion ends, and basically says there may have been other times in other communities where there was the attempt to change it. However, that did not become the mainstream opinion. Mainstream opinion was we have the minhag, and we should follow the minhag, even to the extent where it became another major issue a little bit later in the halachic discourse in the 19th and primarily the 19th century, when Jewish communities, significant Jewish communities, were established in the southern hemisphere. And here is a wonderful sefer which is coming out now, the Piskei Teshuvot. It's written by Rav Shmuel Rabinovich of the Shmuel B'Tzion Rabinovich who is the Rav of Ramat Shlomo. He's the grandson of the former Belzer Rebbe. He's a man in his 50s, if I'm not mistaken. It's a work which is a compilation of tshuvot organized along the lines of the Shulchan Aruch, but the tshuvot that have been written over the course of the last few hundred years. And so on this piece, actually, it's a little bit earlier, he talks about it with regard to Mashiva Baruch Amar Geshem. So he talks about he gives a summary of the different halachic opinions with regard to the southern hemisphere as to what should be done, where there are, where at times it's the exact opposite of the agricultural calendar here. And so he talks about how there were a major debate in the 19th century, but the bottom line became along the following lines, not surprisingly. והגאון שמואל סלנט, רבה של ירושלים, להזכיר שם בגשמים כי לפי ימות החורף שברוב המדינות. So basically, the psak became that there should be two primary positions, a uniformity, if you will, in terms of Tein Talmud Matal Bracha, a northern hemisphere outside, a worldwide position outside of Eretz Yisrael and an Eretz Yisrael position. The Eretz Yisrael position, Zayin Cheshvan, though what we already saw in terms of the psak is that the real, that you can say it if you, or that it's not considered to be an egregious mistake if you do say it, Tein Talmud Matal Bracha, elsewhere. The other position is for everywhere else in the world. And that everywhere else in the world, very ironically, and I perhaps, I agree with Harold's outrage, that we're in effect, we've taken the model of Iraq and cut and pasted for the entire world. So we are in Chutz La'aretz, the model that's been chosen, that's been accepted is primarily the model that started in the Gemara, and people love their Masorah, and they're not willing to change it, even when Rabbanim are telling along the lines of the Rush, one of the greatest poskim of throughout Jewish history, is in this regard follows that position. However, the Psak Halacha, and this is really the source of what Rav Vadia said with regard to Bnei Eretz Yisrael, is that if you are in a community where the rain is necessary and you were to quote unquote make the mistake of asking for rain when it's appropriate in your community, so then you don't necessarily have to say another Shmona Esrei. If it's appropriate from a meteorological perspective to be asking for rain in Spain, as it were, at that time, so then you should be asking, so then we still say the general communal minhag should follow the broader idea, namely the broader minhag of the December start. But if you were to say it at a different time when it's appropriate for your community, you don't have to say Shmona Esrei again. The last point that I want to reach and is what happens if the question occurs if you have a traveler and he has a home, let's say in Eretz Yisrael, and he travels to Chutz La'aretz. So what should he do? So there are a lengthy halachic discussions dealing with all of the possible variables. Namely, is he, how long is he moving to? Does he still have a family and a home in Eretz Yisrael? Did he begin saying it and then traveled, and started on Zayin Cheshvan and then traveled, or he began his travels in the summer and is still abroad when Zayin Cheshvan happens? All of these factors lead to different opinions as to what to do, but there are two primary positions that are set. One position is that it really depends on whether you're planning on returning. In other words, if you are not going to return in this year, in this season, this rainy season, so for all practical purposes, the rain, what's important for you is where you find yourself, and therefore you should be saying it where you are. If, on the other hand, you are going to be returning, and it's a very temporary sojourn, so then you should be saying it based on your where you actually live, and you should be saying it. So Ben Eretz Yisrael should say it on Zayin Cheshvan, even in Chutz La'aretz. There's a question, well, what happens if you're not going to be going back, but your family still lives there? right? You have a home, but you're away on business, and when travel wasn't as convenient, not that travel so convenient in this COVID era, but when travel was much more difficult, so then so you could find yourself in a different place for a long, extended period of time. But but your family still needs the rain. So then it becomes a question as to what to do. So then, according to that opinion, the second opinion, you can follow what your home is, and even if you are going to be away from your home for a long period of time, if your family and and where you actually own your residence, that is in Eretz Yisrael, so then your permanent address is what is the determining factor. So those two opinions are there. I'll just close with the psak of Rav Moshe Feinstein in this regard. So he basically says the following. This is why I want to close with it, is to say that and in this regard, it's very similar to what we said earlier with regard to Rabbi Yosef. He says, so he says, the truth is that where he's writing in New York, but basically he's saying the rush is correct. The real halacha, and he says it quite explicitly, Ha'emet nireh keharash, v'rash b'chol makom lo nahagu kamot. Right? This is I just want to change the color there so it's totally clear that he's saying, let's face it, the rush, his argument is absolutely correct. We should be saying Tein Talamatala Bracha based on the place that you find yourself in at that moment. That is the real halacha, and that's why, as I said, Lachen b'diavad. Therefore, if you were to violate the minhag and say Tein Talamatala Bracha when it's appropriate for your location, but not in the December period, so then you don't have to return and say your Shmona Esrei again. That is the halacha. So, and if that's the case, then he says that Kevan sheben Eretz Yisrael shabalakan leka minhag lo shayach minhag. Therefore, he says, when you talk about a Ben Eretz Yisrael who comes to New York or to anywhere else, and there isn't a minhag there. Yesh lo hatzrich ben leben Eretz Yisrael, af she'ein dato la'achzor, aval yesh lo isha ubanim be'Eretz Yisrael, ben be'ein lo isha ubanim dato la'achzor b'ota shana lishol k'bnei Eretz Yisrael. So then, basically, the person who, even in New York, could really, in theory, be saying Zayin Mercheshvan, because that's the rainy season there too. So then it's certainly for a person who's coming from Israel, should, under any circumstances, should be praying for rain in Eretz Yisrael. But this would not apply necessarily, and he continues and says that it wouldn't apply if you were to come to a community where rain is detrimental at that time of the year, and you're Ben Eretz Yisrael. So then the basic accepted psak halacha is that only if you're planning on returning shortly should you say Tein Talamatala Bracha for going home. If it's a problem for it to be raining wherever you find yourself at that moment, because then if you're going to be staying an extended period of time in that location, so you shouldn't be asking for rain when it's actually detrimental for you and for the people around you. So a pleasure being with everyone again. If there are any questions, I'm happy as always to discuss them. But we've gone over time, so I want to give you your break before the next. It's a real pleasure to have been with you, and looking forward to learning with you again in a couple of weeks' time.